Welcome to Deep Impact Investing with Kimberly Griego-Kiel from Horizon Sustainable Financial Services. In this podcast, we talk about sustainable investing and how your portfolio reflects your values. Do your investments seek accountability from corporations that govern more and more of our society and even the lives we lead? Listen in as we explore the question, are you investing like you give a damn?
Hello and welcome to Deep Impact Investing with Kimberly Griego-Kiel from Horizon Sustainable Financial Services. Today we're talking about a chain, the supply chain. Hello, Kim. How are you?
That's right. I'm great, Eric. How are you?
It took everything in my being not to start singing. Chain, chain, chain. Okay.
Well, we do need to change it. So yeah, go ahead. Sing along.
No, I'm done. That's the only preview anybody gets. So we're talking about a supply chain. I'm very
lots
intrigued.
of supply chains. Yeah. Supply chain issues are down supply chain issues are kind of a big deal. So I thought we would talk about that. What's changed, what's not changed, what we need to be doing, what not us personally, but what companies need to be doing on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
So, and what we should be pushing companies to do on this issue.
Yeah, and I don't think I've ever heard anybody focus, at least nobody that I've listened to has focused on the supply chain. So I'm really intrigued what this means.
Yeah, I think it kind of gets pushed to the back burner unless something really tragic happens, which, 4 or 5 years ago, it was a big issue when there was that huge factory fire in Bangladesh and a lot of mostly women and children died. Supply chain issues came up and they were in the forefront for a while and then it faded away. So yeah, but it's an issue and it's something that we do look at in sustainable investing, and we are pushing to see changes made, and so yeah, I do want to talk about that today, and why should we care? That's not the only reason we should care. Hey, there's a one-off, big fire, and let's pay attention to it for a short period of time, and then we forget about it, but there's a lot of other issues. So I bet you want to know what those are.
I would love to. I mean, what are we focusing on?
Yeah. So it's not just about there was a fire, but the reason so many people died is because those were mainly women who were essentially enslaved in that factory. So there's slavery issues. Those doors were locked. They couldn't get out.
Wow.
Yeah. There are also child labor issues. So there's the forced labor issue, conflict minerals, which we've heard about for a couple of decades now, which the harvesting of those support horrible regimes which we really don't want to be supporting. Product quality issues in terms of where are those products coming from, how are they being created, anti-bribery processes, and in terms of who's getting contracts for this product, that product, the components that goes into those products. Trade security is also a big issue. The social responsibility and energy usage of creating a product, and simply better environmental practices on components that go into creating a product. Automobiles, for example, how those are being made, where the components are coming from. We could probably list another half a dozen things, but those are just some of them.
Yeah.
So those are some of the reasons we want to care.
Yeah. And that's a huge list already. And just thinking about, take Boeing as an example. My father retired from Boeing. They have plants all over the place. And then they also have smaller companies that are supplying, like you said, the supply chain are supplying parts.
Exactly.
I have no idea how many. It'd be very interesting to find out how many companies contribute to one plane. Right?
Oh, I can't even imagine, because there's so many components that go into that. Interestingly enough, my father-in-law also worked for Boeing.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so I didn't know that. But so that brings up, what exactly do we mean by supply chain? And nearly every company that we come into contact with has that has a product that we might buy, has a supply chain, where those components come from and where they're getting those components directly, indirectly. Johan and I were having a conversation with a client this morning, and she said, "What does that mean, supply chain?" And so because we were talking about this issue with her, and we said he was talking to a company last week, and they said, "Oh, we have this battery that we're looking at selling, and it goes underneath solar panels to store the incoming energy source." And Johan was asking him, the president of this company, "So where does the lithium come from that goes into this battery?" And the owner said, "Oh, well, it's this company, and they're part of his supply chain." And he said, "Okay, so where does that company get the lithium?" And he said, "I don't know."
Mm-hmm.
And that's the supply chain. So he really had no idea where the company he bought his battery components from was getting this important piece of the product, which is important. So that's what we want to know. Where does the down the chain product component getting the important pieces from? So yeah, we really want to know.
That's a lot of due diligence. I mean,
absolutely.
Is that even possible, Kim? Really?
Yes, it is. It is possible.
All right.
So, it's important for the company who's buying components to understand where certain pieces, maybe not everything is important, but things that might pollute the environment, harm the people who are putting those components together, know where those products or pieces of those products are coming from. They also need to understand, if they're making clothing, who the actual manufacturers of those pieces of clothing, whether it's Bangladesh, India, China, Korea, wherever they are providing good employment practices for mainly women who are putting those, actually doing the sewing of those products, that they're not basically forced labor, that they're not employing children. They really need to look into those.
Yeah, absolutely.
Situations.
I can see how that would be, critical. I think of larger companies that have many components. We brought Boeing as an example. What a tremendous undertaking that would be. And I think it's important to do that. Are there groups outside of the company themselves that will do that for a company? Do you know?
Well, I'm not sure if there are specific groups, but there are a couple of requirements or laws. Like the U.S. has a requirement, a law really around some supply chain issues, specifically on conflict minerals. Back in 2010, there was a law passed requiring companies conduct a very thorough due diligence process around specific minerals. So it's not just diamonds, but some other minerals, that to make sure that they don't come from the Democratic Republic of Congo or the surrounding areas, to make sure that they're not supporting these the regimes in that area, because that's how they finance war and genocide. And so we want to make sure that that's not happening. And also, interestingly enough, the state of California has a similar law that they passed in 2010, which requires them to file reports that combat slavery and human trafficking in the supply chain of certain companies. And they have to meet those reporting requirements to help prevent abuses and also to help educate consumers on those issues.
Good. Well, I mean, that's a step in the right direction. Do you see a lot of other states doing the same thing?
Right now, no. But it would be great if that was a federal law and not just one state specific. So we'd love to see that be a broader requirement. I think there are more requirements in Europe at this moment around that particular issue as well. But right now, California is the only one doing it that we know of.
Gotcha. All right.
It's interesting too, over the last couple of decades, there's been a huge growth in terms of what we call ESG, or environmental, social governance, or, sustainable investing, which is an easier term for some people, which of course we've been practicing for 21 years. And along with, increased interest in consumer demand for corporate change on this issue. So, we've seen a bigger push. We've seen more shareholder advocacy to look at supply chain issues. And not just because 5 or so years ago there was this huge tragic fire, but also because people are interested in it. We've seen issues with Apple, for example, in the components in their phones. I don't remember what year this was, but this may have been a good 10 years ago. There was a clothing brand, and I don't want to call her out, but a famous television personality who had a clothing brand that I believe was sold at Kmart, which is unfortunately now kind of out of business. But she was having her clothes manufactured at basically sweatshops in China. And that became public. And boy, was there a big backlash around that. So, the social investment industry is really pushing this, and consumers are really pushing this as well. Actually, you did ask me about organizations, and I almost forgot about this, but there's an organization called PRI, Principles for Responsible Investments, that does look at supply chain issues. And this is part of the social investment industry where they really look at the ESG risks. And, it can be kind of daunting for consumers, but in terms of the social investment industry, they really do look at supply chain issues. It's one of many things that they look at. But they offer some guidance for mutual fund managers, for individual stock managers, on how to assess and manage the risks of supply chain issues. So they can remind corporations, they can remind investors that they really do have the power to push supply chain risk management to top levels of corporate agendas, and how to tell corporations this needs to be a priority. Because not only can it damage your corporate reputation, but it can damage your bottom line too. And so It's something that you really do need to pay attention to. Also, in February of 2018, this is a couple years ago, there was a study by MSCI, and they found that corporations that do implement ESG criteria into their supply chains, so that environmental, social, and governance criteria, will help them on an economic basis. So if they're looking at this in the supply chain, there are, and again, there's some best practice responses that they can look at. It'll help them with resiliency, and it will help them look at things like this study showed if they looked at things like reviewing supplier contracts, looking at auditing issues of corporations, identifying the sustainability risks specific to country. Not just, we talked about the Democratic Republic of Congo, but if you look at country risk like China, India, Korea, those places where we see a lot of manufacturing taking place. If you look at sector, clothing manufacturing, auto manufacturing, things like that, you can work to create ethical sourcing strategies, and they can stay on top of the legal issues around this and other regulatory developments. So we see a lot of regulatory stuff happening in the auto industry. I'd like to see more regulatory stuff happening with food manufacturing and clothing manufacturing, because there's not a lot that happens there in other countries. We see regulatory stuff in the US, but those things are not manufactured here much anymore.
True, very true.
Yeah. This topic is so fascinating to me, and it's so big. It's just a wide-ranging topic, and I don't think a lot of investors think about it very much, or consumers certainly don't think about it. But also another thing that I was just thinking of, and this is fairly recent, a couple years ago, this is a food issue. There was a huge backlash when we discovered, and I don't think people think about this very much, a lot of baby infant formula is manufactured in China. And there was a contamination of baby infant formula. I think it was mostly the powdered formula. And it was making infants sick. And I think more so in China, but babies were dying because of that contamination. And so that, again, is a supply chain issue.
Yeah, big time.
Yeah. So here is some other really fascinating and interesting things that I found out when I was doing some research for this podcast. About 2 decades ago, there was a pledge that was put in place by the world's largest chocolate companies that was to prevent child labor in the cocoa harvesting industry and the supply chain. Yeah. This is a huge industry. Think about all the chocolate that we eat, right? Yeah, I know, me too.
Just be honest. I'll be honest.
Easter's coming, right?
Oh, yeah. Yep.
This is a big chocolate season. So in a recent report, none of them have made any significant progress in reducing child labor.
Oh, you're kidding
me. This
went from good news to bad news very quickly.
Right.
Now I'm going to be guilty for eating chocolate.
Right. So 2 decades ago, they made this pledge to work on preventing child labor.
Jeez.
And there's been no significant progress in this process. So I know you're going to eat this chocolate and go, some child probably.
Seriously, right?
Yeah.
Goodness. All right.
I know. It's kind of depressing. I don't mean to depress everybody when they're eating their chocolate, right? Because a little bit of dark chocolate every day is probably really healthy for you. But yeah. So 10 years ago or so, there was an organization called Consumer Good Forum. It's just kind of, I don't know, it's kind of a funny name. But they had about 400 members who passed a resolution, and their idea was to achieve zero net deforestation in the commodity supply chains. And I thought, okay, this is, pretty ambitious, that zero net deforestation. And that's super ambitious. And so in that 10-year time span, 400 members, right? Mm-hmm. Only 21 of them have reported any quantitative progress. So again, I start out with this really great thing, and then I'm like, oh man, this is depressing. But okay, so on this big commitment, it's a 5% progress, and it's really too slow to make any meaningful progress. So I'm like, oh man, what's happening here? So let's talk about.
Why do you think that is?
Well,
honestly.
I think because they make these grandiose claims of, we're going to do this, and we're going to go at 100%, and we're going to do it in this really short period of time. But it doesn't work that way. And you think you're going to get 100% of people on board all at once. And I'm sorry, in the real world, it just doesn't work that way. You really have to progress does tend to work a little bit slower than that. So, we can make efforts. We do move slowly, and we have to take those gains as they come and appreciate them and say, okay, this worked, this didn't work. What can we shift, and how can we make it better?
Maybe I'm more of a pessimist. I'm sorry, Kim. Maybe I'm more of a pessimist, but my thought is, with the whole chocolate company thing, 2 decades, right? I think it was more of we are going to eradicate child labor and cocoa harvesting. Your chocolate's going to be, kid-free, whatever you want to call it. And then they turn around the corner and I'm like, that'll shut them up. Right? Right?
That could be.
That's
Absolutely.
how I feel, because that's ridiculous for it to take that long. And I'm sorry, 10 years. Yes, it's a short time span. Yes, it was a huge goal.
For deforestation. Absolutely.
For deforestation. It was a huge goal. But how about this? How about 400 of the companies make a little tiny bit of progress? Right?
Right.
How is it that only 21 of them made any quantitative progress? I don't even know what quantitative means as far as how much that truly equals.
Measurable. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know what the actual measurable number was. So, but yes, on the child labor issue, it should be more substantive. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think there are similar issues in coffee farming.
Oh, eBay.
Yeah. And I love chocolate and coffee.
I was going to say,
so it's kind of depressing.
If you start naming steaks is a big problem for me. We already talked about that, right? But anyway.
Yeah. So I think that's something that probably needs to be pushed a whole heck of a lot harder.
Yeah.
Not that deforestation is something we should look away from, but child labor, it's really not
There's
negotiable.
No excuse. There's no excuse for it.
Absolutely. And so it's definitely something should be looked at a lot harder. And again, it's a supply chain issue. So you need to go to Nestle, to Kraft, to all of those big companies and say, I'm sorry, you've got to go to your suppliers and make this happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so we in the social investment industry are really pushing that. And I'm going to talk about some shareholder advocacy filings in just a minute and where we're pushing that.
All right.
So
sounds good.
But yeah, so just before I do that, I'm going to talk about some meaningful signals to watch for progress, because we talked about a couple of depressing things. So according to sustainability, ability with a capital A, trends in 2020. And I'll go through these kind of quickly because I think we're kind of pushing up against time on this podcast. But in 2019, 43% of the Carbon Disclosure Project Supply Chain Program, that's kind of a big name, but those members, 43% of those members had confirmed that they currently deselect existing suppliers based on their environmental performance. So that's a really big number. I'd like to see it higher. But further, 30% are considering implementing this process. So 43% are already choosing to not select existing suppliers who are not looking at environmental performance in their supply chain, and 30% more are considering using this process. So that could be a big jump.
Yeah, we got 73% of them on board. We got to just kick the other 27% in the butt to make a decision.
That's right. That would be huge. Another one in a recent report from Deloitte, big auditing company, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was revealed that 34% of large global companies, so these are big conglomerates basically, have already used blockchain technology, and 84% are confident that its mainstream penetration is inevitable. So why is this important? Simply put, it will allow the transparency and verification of data to be processed efficiently and securely. So that's what we mean by blockchain. And so what we want in the supply chain is that information to be passed through. Because I think for a long period of time, it was hard to get all of that data clearly and accurately reported. And so we want all of that information. Also, I mentioned the European Union earlier, but the EU is now supporting regulations to protect child workers in the cocoa markets. So we just talked about chocolate, right? They're supporting these regulations that would map out how cocoa supply chains disclose human rights violations, and hopefully that will force out violators. So the European Union has long been much farther ahead than the US in a lot of these sustainability initiatives. And actually a lot of big cocoa producers are European and not necessarily US based. So that's actually a really great thing.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm tired of coming in second place or third or fourth or 10th to other countries when we are quote unquote, enlightened and we have good human rights and we treat everybody great, blah, blah, blah. I'm sorry. We can do so much more in a much better job. So.
Absolutely. Here's another one that's also European based. So in 2019, the Netherlands passed new legislation that would have company executives criminally prosecuted if their businesses were proven to have repeated incidences of child labor.
Love that.
Wouldn't that be
way to go,
Yes,
Netherlands.
I do too. Wouldn't that be great if we could have that here in the U.S. or in other countries, especially in emerging markets where that tends to happen?
Yeah, and
that would be great.
Even if child labor isn't a huge issue here in the U.S., and I have no idea how bad it is here if we have a huge issue with it, holding our own U.S.-based companies accountable for turning a blind eye to it. I think I would love for them to be prosecuted because maybe that would light a fire under their butts to do something about it.
It absolutely would. Yeah. If they were ignoring their supply chain issues, if they were aware of what was happening in the down chain supply issues and they ignored it, absolutely, that would be excellent.
And they do.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yes,
they absolutely do.
Yeah.
They know what's
absolutely.
going on. Even a small glimpse, just crack it open. Really find out what's going on. If you suspect something, executive, do something about it. Right?
Yep.
I mean, it's yeah. Okay.
Yep, I do. So 2 more things that we can watch to see progress in this area. IBM actually has developed what they call the IBM Food Trust. And alongside other companies such as Nestle and Kroger and Carrefour, I'm not actually familiar with Carrefour, but they provide end-to-end supply chain visibility of food products, which I think is incredibly important. This needs to be shared across all product manufacturers, so not just food. Our food chain supply issues are extremely important, as I mentioned the baby food products earlier. So yeah.
Now wait a second. You said Nestle.
Yes.
So
Nestle.
they're not part of this?
Yes, they are part of this whole process. Mm-hmm.
Oh, good. So maybe one of those chocolate companies has turned a corner.
Maybe.
All right.
Let's hope. you can maybe get your chocolate fix.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And the last one I have on here, and there are more, but these are, I think, some of the top 6 important ones. In 2019, again, because, we don't have a lot that we know for 2020 because it's early, the number of climate disclosure product supplier respondents, again, we talked about the climate disclosure project earlier, the respondents who reported that they are currently engaging with their suppliers on climate change. Again, very important issue.
Mm-hmm.
And the numbers increased by 1/3. So it's up by 35%. It was only 23% in 2017. So in a 2-year period, the numbers of supply chain folks, or people who are engaging their supply chain, are up by 12%.
That's fantastic. Do we know what that engagement looks like?
So they're talking to their suppliers on issues around climate change and how are you affecting, your water supply? What are you doing with your waste products? Issues like that. What's happening with your discharge into the atmosphere, things like that. So they're looking at their suppliers on things that are affecting, climate change.
Gotcha.
Which are excellent.
I hope they're not just asking the questions and they're actually holding them accountable for it and saying, okay, to continue being a supplier for us, we need to see some changes and here's a timeline for that.
I would hope so as well.
Yeah.
And if they're not, then we in the social investment industry are doing that.
Absolutely.
So,
that's fantastic.
Right. And which is where we get to the shareholder advocacy, which is the last piece I want to mention here. It's still super early in the proxy season for 2020. Shareholder resolutions are just now being filed. Voting season comes up in basically April and May and June. It's when people get flooded with all of those things where you need to check those boxes. So if you're getting your shareholder proxy votes, please vote them. Please make sure your investment managers are voting them if you delegate that process to your investment managers, because now is the time to pay attention to that. We don't have a ton of information in the early part of the season, but what I know right now is that in 2019, if we look back, there were 6 resolutions that were filed on anti-slavery issues by one organization only, because there's a lot of people who file these. As You Sow, we've mentioned them before, did 6 different companies on anti-slavery issues. Another organization, ICCR, I love these 2 organizations a lot, did a number of resolutions on human rights issues, including with Amazon, specifically on modern slavery in the supply chain. They did one also with Kohl's Group Limited. And they did several, as we just talked about, with deforestation and on prison labor in the supply chain, which is a big issue. 2019, we saw a lot of filings on prison labor in supply chains because, believe it or not, they use prison labor, which is essentially what we would call modern day slavery.
Yeah, interesting. I've never really thought about that as far as being a huge problem, but yeah.
They pay them pennies.
Well, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Commissary privileges or whatever,
Yep. Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well,
so there you go. Supply chain. Interesting topic, I think. Big issue. We could probably talk about it for an hour or two.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's kind of, the brief issues around it. And, we're all going to eat chocolate. I don't want people to feel guilty, but, we need to think about, where our food comes from, where our clothing comes from, how our cars are manufactured, pretty much everything, and the stocks that we own and what's happening with those. Again, the screening, the shareholder advocacy, it's all incredibly important. So
absolutely. Once companies realize that investors are going to talk with their dollars and say, look, I'm not going to continue to support a company that has no problem with child slavery or child labor or just really terrible working conditions for families and people in third world countries that already have a pretty tough lot in life. And now we're going to make their work life horrible as well. Come on. I'm done investing in you. That's when companies are truly going to start changing.
Absolutely.
And through this advocacy. And I think that people can speak with their voice and with their money very effectively. And we can get these companies to start paying attention.
Exactly. And it's so incredibly important to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Kim, thank you so much. If people want to reach out and get some of these resources, how do they get a hold of you?
They can reach us two ways. They can call us 505-982-9661, or they can send us an email at info@horizonssfs.com. And they can find us on Facebook too. They can look us up at Horizon Sustainable Financial Services on Facebook.
All right. And we'll have to talk about Facebook and their business practices another day.
Yes, that's a big one.
But it's a great way for us to get that message out. So visit Kim and her team on Facebook. You'll definitely get some good info there. Kim, I want to thank you again for your time. This was a fantastic podcast.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. And I certainly love telling our audience about all of these interesting topics. And thanks for listening, folks.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to the Deep Impact Investing Podcast with Kimberly Griego-Kiel. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Kim comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. This makes it much easier to share these podcasts with your friends and family. Thanks again for listening today. For everyone at Horizon Sustainable Financial Services, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to Deep Impact Investing Podcast, the sustainable, responsible impact investing podcast that shows you how to get your voice heard. It's time to start investing like you give a damn. To ask a question that we can answer on an upcoming podcast, email us at info@horizonssfs.com or join the conversation on Facebook at www.facebook.com/Horizons Sustainable Financial Services, or give us a call at 505-982-9661. Don't forget to click the subscribe button to be notified when new episodes become available. The companies we may speak about during our podcast are not recommendations for investment only. You and your financial advisor can determine what the right investments are for you and your situation. Horizon Sustainable Financial Services is a registered investment advisor, registered with the state of New Mexico, and other jurisdictions were registered or exempted. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the host and or guest, and do not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Horizon Sustainable Financial Services. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.